John Gard here. So you've decided to drag your grandpa's plow out of the trees to take it to plow day next weekend. In this video, I will show you the 5 things you need to do to get the plow ready for plow day. The first thing you want to do with a new plow is measure and inspect for straightness. This is not part of my 5 things you should do, because if this is Grandpa's plow, you're going to use it regardless. But if this plow is not Grandpa's plow, and you may toss it to the side, and if you're particular about doing a really nice job with the plow, you want to make sure it's straight. And what we're doing is making sure the plow is not bent. And we're trying to find out if the bottoms are all lined up parallel to each other. It may be very subtle at first, but as you get the plow dialed in and coulters adjusted, and you'll start to notice that, boy, the plow just isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, or the dirt's just not rolling off one bottom like it's supposed to. And you take a look at it closer, and oh yeah, by golly, the thing is bent. And the first thing we can do with a plow that's 3 bottoms or larger is to simply eyeball down the tails of the moldboards. And when we do that, we can see that the bottoms are just not quite lined up. We can also sight down that top corner of the shin, and we can see that from this angle, they're also not perfectly lined up. And so we don't know which bottom is the offending bottom, so we need to do a little more inspection. So before we break out the tape measure, we can do a little more eyeballing. So if you have a 2 bottom, when you don't have a 3rd bottom to compare against, we can do these tricks. The first thing we're going to do is eyeball down the beam and compare it against the Landside and share, just to eyeball whether they are parallel or not. This one looks good. We'll look at bottom number 2. We'll just kind of look down the beam and look down the share. Yeah, that looks good. That doesn't look terrible. We'll go to number 3. We're looking at the Landside and the beam to see if they're parallel to each other, and that looks good too. Then we'll also look down the top of the beams to make sure they're not twisted. No obvious sways or bows in those beams. And they all look okay. And we're looking for some of the more common problems that I have come across. I've had 2 different plows. One was a bent frog, one was a bent beam, where the front bottom was pointing this way. So the front Landside pouched up really fast, and the plow always wanted to trend towards the plowed ground, which plows don't do that. And once I started inspecting and measuring, yep, sure enough, the front and bottom was pointed this way. And then I had another plow that no matter what I did, it always cut 3 inches wider than it was supposed to across the whole width of the plow. And I started looking at it, and sure enough, the back bottom was pointed this way, and I could look across the top of the beam, and you could see the beam was bowed, so the plow must have hit a rock and bent the back beam like that. So let's look a little closer and break out the tape measure. So kind of similar how we're eyeballing down the tails of the moldboards, I'm going to measure between bottoms at 4 different points so I can see if each bottom is parallel to each other and to see which bottom is deviating from the other bottoms. So I'm going to measure from shin to shin at this top corner, and I've got about right at 25 inches. And I'll measure where that shin meets the share, and I'm right at 25 inches again. I'll measure where the bottom of the moldboard meets the share back here, and I'm right at 25 inches. Then I'll find this little nub from the stamping process at the tail of the moldboard, and that measures about 24 7/8. And then I'll measure between bottoms 2 and 3. So back here we've got 25 inches again, 25 inches again, 25 inches again, and back here at the nub, we've got just a hair over 25 inches. So this is like the straightest plow I have ever seen. You know, I had like 3/16 inch of a difference between the tails, between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. That's really good. For a contest plow, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch is about the max that I want to tolerate. If you're using a plow in the field, I think anything over 1/2 an inch you're going to start to notice. But we can't let the measurements tell the whole story, because what if those bottoms could be bent in such a way that they're still going to be parallel to each other. The measurements are still going to pass, but they're still out of alignment. And that's probably what's going on here. This plow is an international number 8 Little Genius. I call this a 2-bottom with an add-on 3rd bottom. It probably came from the factory like this, but the idea was that this is not a full-length beam, and you could unbolt this if you wanted to and make it into a 2-bottom. Rarely do I see one of these plows that are straight. They are almost always bent. International made them like this, J.I. Case, Minneapolis Moline, early John Deere number 5s, co-ops, cockshuts, and they almost always have the same problem. They are just not a strong way of building a plow. And I think what's happening is this rear bottom hits a rock, and these bends in these cross braces just keep bending. So this 3rd bottom is just going to go up and over towards the main frame of the plow. And here's an example of a plow that is bent too far. When we sight down the tails of the moldboards and the shin of the moldboards, it is clearly not straight. And when I measure between bottoms, there's up to 1.5 inches difference between the measurements. Does it make the ground black? Sure, but it does not do a nice job plowing. So what do you do if your plow is bent? You can go find another plow. You can swap out the offending part if you can determine which one it is. Another trick, I've done this on a 2-bottom. This is a more common trick on 4, 5, 6-bottom plows. If every bottom is bent and you can't tell which one is the offending one, you can swap parts from position to position. So you can swap bottoms, you can swap the bottom and the trip assembly if it's a trip reset plow, bottom and the standard, and you can just swap them from like between 2 and 3, for example. And the hope is if whatever it's bolted to is also bent, by swapping positions, maybe those bends cancel each other out and you magically fix it. So finally, on to the list. Number 1, let's look at shares and landsides. 99% of the problems that guys have with moldboard plows can be traced back to a root cause associated with shares and landsides. You just can't adjust a moldboard plow properly if the shares and landsides are not in good condition. They are the fundamental pieces of making a plow work properly. The share sucks the plow on the ground and the landside holds it straight. Okay, since plow day is this weekend, I'm going to try to assess the condition of the shares quickly without taking them off the plow. I'll do that by putting a straight edge up here and putting it against the point of the share and the back of the landside to see if there is any suck in the share. So at the lowest point of the share, there is some clearance here. Theoretically, you don't need just a whole lot. Now, if I roll this up to get it up to this outside corner of the share, there's precious little suck in that share there. So this share has been hard surfaced. It was used in coarse textured ground, so it developed some funky wear patterns. And this is kind of like what you'd see with a throwaway lay or bolt-on blade type share. Their tips will round off like this, and you got to be careful about that because that tip will round off so far that pretty soon the landside will be driving the plow out of the ground. Now also be careful, we'll get to landsides in a minute, but if your landside is wore in this back corner, this is not going to be an accurate test. You need to have a landside that's good enough where this very bottom corner is not wore off, because once you put a nice new landside on here, you might lose the suck that you think you had. So this share passes the initial test. Now we'll look at it from another angle. So the next test you need to do is get down at what would be the bottom of the furrow bottom and eyeball that cutting edge of the share. Find the leading cutting edge of the share and look below it. Anything below that is a sled runner that's going to drive the plow out of the ground. And you do that all along the cutting edge of the share. This one's got some funk going on because of that hard surfacing, but it looks pretty darn sharp. might want to do something about this. Then we can also kind of eyeball down the point down the land side. Yep, we've still got some suck there. So here's another bottom for comparison's sake. You take a look at the share. Looks like it's got a good point. That should suck in the ground, right? But let's get down to the furrow bottom level. We'll find the leading cutting edge of the share. And here's some of that sled runner I'm talking about. So as these shares wear, they'll round off and they'll get quite a sled runner built up underneath here. That needs to be ground off or the point rebuilt. Same thing goes for all along this share. That's all sled runner, and we need to take a look at the sled runner along the whole cutting edge of the share. Definitely check out my other video on plowshares for more details about fixing and rebuilding plowshares. Let's look at landsides next. The highest wear area for a landside is right here. If you can tell that it is worn, you probably should do something about it. As they wear, they like to round off on this corner, which makes a perfect ramp for the plow to work up and over on, and that's not what you want. You want a nice, sharp corner here to hold the plow from kicking over to the left. And here is an example of a landside that is long past due doing something about it. It is worn so far that now we're wearing into the frog, which is not good. So what do you do about it? If it's just worn a little bit in this corner, maybe you could apply some weld beads on here to build it back up. Depending on how far gone it is, you could weld just some junk along here in the worst spots, here, here, here. I've seen a landside that was a farmer modification on a farm auction where the whole landside was nothing but nuts and bolts and sickle sections all welded together. Anything to build this back up. What you could also do is, if you've got a throwaway lay plow, put on new throwaway lays and take your old throwaway lays and weld them on here. Or you could simply replace the landsides. I like to make them from scratch. They're not that difficult. And what I also like to do is be able to put washers behind them to space them out so I can fine tune how straight the plow is pulling. Number 2 is to clean rust off moldboards. Here on the fruited plains of South Dakota, I absolutely have to clean rust off the moldboards or else this thing will never scour. Now, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, I don't have to do this because if I make one round with the plow, it'll be cleaned off and it'll be scouring. Because I live in Western Ohio and I have heavy clay ground, or I live in Pennsylvania or New York and the ground is really coarse. You may be right, but when you're in a plow day, you don't plow very much. And so I would rather use my precious little time when the plow is in the ground to get a good land polish rather than wasting time cleaning the rust off. So I would rather put a little bit of effort into it and get that rust off in the shop. So here's my procedure on cleaning rust off. Step 1, take off the big chunks with a wire wheel. Okay, step 2 is to take a flap disc or a grinding disc and take that next layer off. The goal here is to get the rust and that black oxide layer off and get down to good steel. Now, be careful as you're getting closer. Don't put in new scratches with your grinding discs. And when you do grind, try to go with the direction that the soil flows so that if you do put in new scratches, you're kind of following those old scratches the soil made. So you can see here, I'm starting to break through that black oxide layer and I see good steel. It's so fun to watch that black oxide layer disappear to reveal good shiny metal. So on some moldboards, that black oxide layer just melts away. Other moldboards are quite rusty and it takes a lot of work to get that black oxide layer off. If that's the case, we'll move on to step 3. This is the worst step. But the most effective way I've found to get rust off is to hand sand it. Super coarse sandpaper, 60, 80 grit, whatever it takes, because this is basically soil, right? And hand sanding with sandpaper is more effective because you're sanding in the direction that the soil flows, so you're getting that sandpaper down into those old grooves. You can run power tools across that moldboard all day long, but as long as you're going across those old scratches, you're not going to do anything. You have to get into those old scratches to get that cleaned up. I don't get too worried about making new scratches with this step, because if you're scratching in the same direction the soil is flowing, they're not harmful. Now, if you're looking for a place to be lazy, right here is where your most soil pressure is. You don't have to worry so much about this area, but you need to focus on this area, because this is where the least soil pressure is, and this is where the soil is going to stick and cause you the most scouring issues. Well, that awful project is done. If you're grinding along with your grinding disc or your flap disc and you think you're getting close, when they wear down, they tend to just polish that black oxide layer. So if you think you're good, get out your hand piece of sandpaper and sand it, and you'll find where those rust spots are still there. And as you start to take the rust off the moldboard, you can assess the condition of the moldboard better. This one's got a little pocket wore out, where it wore through the hard surface layer down to the soft center, and every moldboard is a little thin towards the end here. If this is a plow day plow, you could probably run it like this. If this pocket was any deeper, I'd maybe want to weld some weld beads on here to build it back up. If you really want to do a nice job with the plow and want to make it look nice, I'd maybe find some better moldboards for this plow. On to the next thing. Step number 3 is to inspect and grease your wheels and your clutch lift. Now, you might think this is not a big deal and you can just shoot some grease and things in letter buck, but it's not going to take that much time to take things apart and make sure things are working like they're supposed to. I know with my luck, if I don't do anything with the clutch, the first time I use it, I pull the trip rope, the plow is going to fall down, and it's going to come back up, and it's going to fall, and it's going to come back up. The clutch will just keep cycling and never stay down. Or you might pull the rope and the plow drops and you get to the other end of the field, then it won't raise for you. When your clutch doesn't work, your day is basically ruined. So let's take a look at it. Now, despite what some people say about the John Deere enclosed clutch, you can take them apart. I know when I first heard that story, I pictured pulling that apart and springs and parts going flying everywhere. No, the clutches are pretty simple. Let's take them apart and see what's going on. Interesting. That's a lot of sand and dirt in there. So the main goal of fixing clutch lifts is to make sure all the springs are in there that aren't broke, clean out all the old dry grease, make sure the rollers and things are working like they're supposed to, making sure roll pins are where they're supposed to be, just making sure nothing's broken there. There, I think that looks pretty good. I'm just going to run it with light oil on it. Everything cleaned up and lubed up. Let's wipe up the dirt, grease it, and put it back together. And then we'll grease her up. So onto the furrow wheel. A lot of these old implements and plows did not have wheel bearings. It was just simply a cast hub riding on a steel axle. Roller bearings did not show up until the mid-1950s. If you do have sealed roller bearing hubs, give her a spin, see if you can feel the bearings are rough. If they're rough, you definitely need to replace bearings. If you can't feel that they're rough, take it apart, clean the bearings up. If you can see pits in the rollers, you got to replace the bearings. Pack the bearings with grease, put a new seal in, put it back together. If you don't have roller bearings, you got a pretty simple arrangement here. Just clean up the old dry grease, put it back together again. This might seem pretty simple, but if you have a John Deere plow, John Deere's used a cast sleeve that got pinned to the axle, and then the wheel hub rode on that cast sleeve. Well, I've seen where that sleeve will shear the pin and the sleeve gets rusted tight to the wheel hub, so now the sleeve is riding on the axle, and that's not what John Deere intended. So that's why I say you need to take this apart, make sure things are working like they're supposed to, grease it and put it back together. And we'll grease her up and we'll be done. And lastly, the tail wheel. By its very nature, running at an angle, the tail wheel is very prone to getting moisture and dirt in it. If the plow sat for a long time, it's probably the first thing that sunk into the dirt. So don't forget to check out the tail wheel. Wow. See what I mean? Rusty, rusty, rusty. Try to clean up some of this rust. Wow. All right, now that everything is cleaned up, I can slather some grease on stuff and put it back together. Pump some grease in. Now that the wheel hubs are lubed up, I can swap in some better wheels. These rims are rusted out and too far gone, so I found some different rims to paint up and mount some tires on. Ooh, doesn't that look nice? Now, if your plow needs new tires, don't go and buy modern car radials or motorcycle tires. That looks awful. Implement tires are not that expensive. Go dig through your couch cushions or break open your piggy bank. Make your plow look nice. Or do what I did and go scrounge around at farm auctions for the next 20 years and buy old bias ply car and pickup tires. You know, the kind of tires that are at the very end of the auction sale and you have to wait to the very end of the day before they get to them. And they're in a pile. You have to buy a whole pile of them for $5. And you have to bid against the crazy old hoarder who has a neck beard and his pants are brown and shiny because he hasn't changed them for a whole month. Those are the kind of tires that you want. And that way they look vintage and period correct. Because the story goes that some plows were shipped to dealerships without tires. And this story is particularly true for international. So if Mr. Farmer bought a brand new plow, he was supposed to bring in used car tires to put on his new plow, which at the time, in the 1940s and 50s, would be old bias ply tires like this. Number 4, fix your levers. You need to lengthen both the furrow and the land lever so that you can adjust both of them from the seat of the tractor. You also don't want them so long that they're poking you in the back, especially when you're going through uneven ground, or banging against the seat of the tractor, or banging up your fenders. If you're new to plowing, and even if you aren't, I'm going to challenge you to 2 things at your next plow day. Number 1, adjust your depth. Make sure you're plowing as deep as the organizer wants you to so that you make them happy and they invite you back next year. If they don't specify a depth, 6 to 8 inches is a good range. And make sure to get out the tape measure to verify your depth. Number 2, adjust your furrow lever to make sure you're throwing level and making sure you're filling in against the previous pass. Now, inevitably, you're not going to be following someone with the same width plow and they won't be plowing the same depth as you. You can turn around and adjust your furrow lever so that your plowing is filling in and matching with their plowing. Now you might need to hook the plow up to the tractor to do this. Or you can eyeball it. You know, the levers relative to the hitch. Set the levers about halfway up, you know, about where you think plowing depth will be. I've done this enough times so I know how long they have to be. The next step is to replace these old rods. They are fatigued and they're rotten, and I break them quite often. You got to replace them. Go to the hardware store, get some 3/16 rod and some cable clamps, and replace them. When this rod breaks, it's another thing that can ruin your day. Because once it's broke, what do? You have to go back to the pickup. Hopefully you've got a vice grip. Stick a vice grip on here so you can adjust it, but then the only way you're going to adjust it is to get off the seat and stop the tractor and go back here and grab your vice grip to try to adjust your furrow lever. No fun. These cable clamps work really well for this. If you want to use the original clamps, just so you can be original, that's fine, but make sure you use new nuts and bolts because I've had those little 1/4-inch bolts break off before too. So put the clamps out towards the end of the rod so you don't have long ends sticking out flopping around. And you might have to experiment with the length of the rod. You want it short enough so you can be able to get that toggle out of the quadrant, but you also can lengthen a little bit to make it easier to grab onto the handle here. Getting closer. And finally, number 5, loosen every single adjustment on the plow and lube it up so that you can adjust it when you're in the field. You don't want to be fighting rusty nuts and bolts when you're in the field. Because when you're at plow day, you don't want to be wasting time adjusting the plow. You want to be able to adjust something really quick and get back to plowing. Some fasteners might require some persuasion. Lube up all the linkages at the tail wheel. Lube up your coulter clamps. Don't forget this coulter fork clamp down here too. It looks a little different on each different plow, but be particularly careful on international plows. This is just a little set screw and it could easily get broke off, and that's no fun extracting things out. And lube up your hitch adjustment. Lube your horizontal hitch adjustment and your vertical hitch adjustment. Now I'll say this just for the sake of being provocative, but the only correct location for this vertical hitch adjustment is all the way down. Bolt in the top hole, which makes this plate all the way down. Get your plow hitch as low as possible on this end. And then, if you need to adjust the angle of the plow drawbar, raise or lower your tractor clevis. The only reason to raise this would be if this is scraping on the ground, dragging trash, which probably means you're plowing too deep. Definitely check out my hitch adjustment video for more details. And there you go. This plow is ready for the field, and I am excited to try it out. I did not talk about coulters in detail in this video because some people don't run coulters. But if you do, definitely check out my video on adjusting coulters. Hope this video helped on getting your plow ready for plow day. Thanks for sticking in there. It turned out to be a way longer video than I thought it was going to be. So stay tuned for the next video.